Comic books. Whether you've read one or not, you cannot deny the huge influence it has had on the 21st century's pop culture. With roots arguably going back to the Stone Age, this form of storytelling has been popular for many years. Google defines a comic book as a magazine that presents a serialized story in the form of a comic strip, typically featuring the adventures of a superhero. And while the cave drawings may not technically be comics, they still maintain the same concept of using drawings to tell a story. A slightly more traditional version of the modern comic originated in the 15th century, with two main types, political and private. These old comics are mostly German woodcuts, which told the stories of the lives of saints. Over time, and moving into the 17th century, comic strips became more propagandistic and were based on political events. Nowadays, explicit political topics are not frequently discussed in comics, and particularly not comics published by large companies such as DC and Marvel. Comics as we know them today have evolved from comic strips found in magazines. They were originally made as simple entertainment within the magazines to get a quick laugh out of the reader, and it rapidly gained popularity from there. The Yellow Kid, which debuted in 1896 in the New York World newspaper, is widely regarded as the first modern comic. It was a single-panel comic that showed a boy in a large yellow nightshirt in a place called Hogan's Alley with other odd children. It was most well known for the strange slogans that the boy was seen with, and it ran for 2 years until 1898. From that point, other comic strips gained more mainstream popularity, and in 1934 a company called National Comics Publications was created by Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson. Their first comic was published 3 years later in 1937 titled Detective Comics 1, which featured a detective called Cyril Speed Saunders as he solved a murder case. 2 years later, in Detective Comics 27, which was published in March 1939, a new character called Batman was introduced and started to gain popularity in the pages of National Comics. Around the same time, in June 1938, another iconic character called Superman had his debut in Action Comics 1. A year later, in 1939, another comic company was established under the name of Timely Publications. The first comic that they published was called Marvel Comics 1, which eventually became the name of the company in the early 1960s after changing it to Atlas Comics in 1951. These beginnings for the comic book industry are now regarded as the golden age for comics. This age was most widely accepted as being from 1938 with the introduction of Superman to 1954, and saw the first appearances of many iconic superheroes such as Batman, Robin, Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern, Aquaman, Captain America, and so on and so forth. This age's comics had many stories in which superheroes would fight America's real enemies, such as Hitler, which provided a moral boost for the country at the time. The next age to come along was the Silver Age, which was from 1954 until 1970. This age is characterized by the increased popularity of comic books as a genre, as it became more mainstream in American entertainment. It also saw the establishment of the Comics Code Authority, which was an alternative to government regulation and allowed publishers to self-regulate their content. It restricted what comics companies could and could not publish due to public concerns surrounding graphic horror and violence at the time, not unlike modern-day concerns about video games. While the code was not mandatory, many stores wouldn't sell comics that were not approved by the authority. This resulted in many companies going out of business due to the content in their comic books. Although the code was enforced worldwide, a lot of the rules reflected American culture and society at the time, which meant that zombies, vampires, ghouls, and werewolves were originally banned in the code. Other things that happened during the Silver Age was the beginning of Fantastic Four and the first appearance of Spider-Man in Amazing Fantasy 15, which was published in August 1962. He was created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko after a surge in teenage demand for comic books, as they wanted to create a character that teens could relate to. In his first appearance, Peter Parker failed to stop his Uncle Ben from being killed by a burglar, which motivated him to use his superpowers to become a hero. Such a hugely positive response to his debut was unexpected. In a survey that I ran, I asked people to name the first Marvel character that came to mind, and almost 30% of the 229 voters said Spider-Man was their first thought. This was rivaled only by Batman, who held 20% of the votes in the same question about DC characters. The next comic age was the Bronze Age, which was from 1970 to 1985. In this age, darker plots regarding real-life issues similar to the content seen in the early Golden Age, like drug use, poverty, and pollution, became more common again. This was partially due to changes in the code, which was edited in 1971 to allow vampires, ghouls, and werewolves, if handled traditionally, like in Dracula, and also allowed sympathetic depiction of criminal behavior and corruption among public officials. The Bronze Age is also recognized by the undeniable change to the industry overall during these years. It also marked the end of many great writers' careers as more and younger writers joined the industry. Moving into the Modern Age, the lines start to get a bit blurry. It's generally accepted that the Modern Age is from 1985 to present day. However, considering the length of time that other ages have lasted, some online communities have made smaller categories to define things in this age. These refined categories are called the Copper Age, which is 1985 to 1999, the Plastic Age, which is 2000 to 2019, and the Pixel Age, which is 2020 to present. The modern age as a whole is defined by several different trends, such as the commercialization of comic publishers, increasing amounts of psychologically complex characters, and more layered plots. As well as this, the modern age introduced anti-heroes such as Elektra and Wolverine, and contained the rise in popularity of the X-Men. There aren't many particularly defining moments for each of the smaller categories, other than the Pixel Age having been caused by increasing popularity of digital comics and apps such as Webtoon. A positive to come out of the modern age in comics is increased representation of minority groups. While there are still major issues in the industry, particularly regarding whitewashing and ableism, we now have special issues for things like Black History Month and Pride, as well as an increase in openly LGBT characters. I spoke to Alan Kaplan, a queer comic book writer and artist who recently created the first transmasculine character in DC Comics, called Jules Jourdain. Jules debuted in Lazarus Planet Dark Fate 1, which was published in February 2023.
I was approached by Andrea Shea, who's the editor at DC and kind of like the architect behind the DC Pride stuff, and with the task of creating a trans male character to debut, because like Lazarus Planet was, like, hey, we have this option to create a bunch of new characters, and then we have the Pride stuff, so there'll be like at least 2 guaranteed stories with the character. We have like introduction and then like kind of like bring them back for the second one and then hope people like it. They wanted a trans man, and I was like, yeah, but what are superhero comics other than like studies in masculinity? So like, if he's he could just be as basically Batman but trans, and that would be cool. But why use that character when you could also use Batman, because Batman's gonna sell your book more? So right. Trying to like, yeah, but if he's like trans-masculine but like not super binary, that's a character that we don't have already that you could tell a more interesting story with. And they got like no pushback on that. They're like, sure, whatever. So I was given a lot of freedom but I don't know what happened behind my back about that. I was a little nervous at first. I'm like, oh god, like you just want like you need to whatever, you just like corporate representation of stuff, like god, I don't want to do this. I was like, oh, they're giving like I can do whatever I want with this. There's learning that like the editor behind this is like created DC Pride, like clawed her way into making it happen and really loves the project. It's not just like, oh, DC does this to like cash in. It's like, no, people at DC really want to make this and like really want to have queer creators telling their own stories. It's like, oh, this has been really fun to do in a way that I was like not expecting. I was maybe too cynical about it. So for me, in terms of like writing a trans character, like he's not just gonna go up and like introduce himself that way, just like, here's everything you need to know about me. Like, that's boring writing and people don't do that. But if it's not on page, another writer 10 years from now could be like, who's this weird dude, and just like forget that the character is trans. It's right. Like, it would be funny, but it's one of those like, oh, okay, there's this whole other side to like anything I want to have stick with this character just has to be on the comic page explicitly in a way that no one can forget. Yeah. And that's kind of weird, but makes sense, I guess.
Yeah. I'd like to give thanks to Alan for taking the time out of his day to talk to me about the comic book industry and the people who genuinely care about representation there. You can help to support the increase in representation by buying comics at your local comic book store, or by checking out one of the apps that I mentioned earlier and buying digitally. Thank you for watching.